Three, two, one. We're live. Welcome, everybody. So excited to see you and hear you all tonight. And for those of you who are joining us on the replay, we appreciate you being here with Music Row 411 tonight. We've got a real treat for you. We promised we would bring you the best information in all the different areas you need to know. So tonight we have a very special treat. We have somebody who is going to help you get your house in order, meaning your money house in order. And I'm very pleased and thrilled to welcome JudeAnne Armenti of JA Creative. And she has been helping people get their money house in order and helping with accounting things in a very large way, from box offices to touring professionals. And she's really kind of blown up on Clubhouse and become the go-to person for lots of people's business affairs. So welcome, JudeAnne. We're so happy to have you tonight.
Oh, thanks, Beth. I'm really excited to be with you here on Music Row 411.
Yeah, we have our Live from Music Row 411 series, and they're very popular as we bring only the best, and you're only the best. So why don't we dive right in and have you tell our audience just a little bit about yourself and why you got into music and why you like helping people organize their money and do all the accounting things.
Well, I got into music really early on. I've been a fan of music since toddlerhood. I was one of those kids that just annoyed the family incredibly day in and day out, all day long. If my family had known about Ritalin, I would have been getting some.
Me too.
So, but my aspirations as a musician didn't last for very long, but my ability to understand money kind of got the better of me, and that's the path I ended up choosing. And when I was able to parlay that into the music business, I really found my niche. So I've wanted to help musicians and creatives understand the fundamentals of finance, particularly because there is just such a history of people being subjected to predatory arrangements and
That's
practices within the industry that are incredibly detrimental to an artist. And it doesn't matter what level you're at, even those at the highest echelon of the music business have lost so much so
Billy
often.
Joel got milked by his brother-in-law for like
Yeah.
36 million 25, 30 years ago. And that would be, the equivalent of what, 50 million today or something like that. So
Yeah.
happens.
Yeah. And unfortunately, I was just watching a documentary last night on Amazon Prime called uh, Hired Gun. It was an excellent documentary on people who are professional musicians and get hired by these big names to go into the studio or go out onto the road and be their band without being a member of the band, having a share in the revenues. They're just paid a salary.
Go sing.
And yeah, Billy Joel's drummer was
Liberty DeVito.
Liberty DeVito. Exactly. He was a central figure in the documentary, and he discussed what happened in that embezzlement and basically how it changed Billy Joel forever.
Oh,
And
I'll have to watch it.
it was so eye opening. And in regards to that situation, a little bit heartbreaking because the guys that he started out with and made all the great songs with him lost every connection with him because of that embezzlement. Billy Joel's ability to trust people who had been around him for decades was shattered, from
Yeah.
what I
I know
understood.
his bass player well.
Right.
And so this is a good segue into what is the number one mistake that you see or that is fairly common when it comes to creators and their money? aside from the crooks, what is the biggest mistake that, people, oh, I'll let somebody else worry about it, or I'll get to it later. I think, there's a big, scary, hairy thing called money, and people don't like to deal with it. So they make mistakes by avoiding it, right?
Right. The thing is that there's many many mistakes that everybody makes with their money. It's the greatest mistake that anybody can make is not paying any mind to it whatsoever.
Okay.
And for musicians, that's compounded by the stereotype that musicians just are generally not inclined to understand such things. And I could use a bunch of different words to describe my impression of that stereotype, but I'll go with hogwash. So I believe, and there are studies done, that music education is the best foundation for what is so prevalent in education today, and that is the STEM disciplines. So that's the sciences, the technologies, all that highfalutin industry stuff that they're saying that the kids do best with if they understand music. So that tells me musicians are inherently inclined to understand money, to understand numbers, to understand math. And that's really all accounting is. It's math, just using different terms than adding or subtracting.
JudeAnne, I've never heard it put that way, in all of my years, and I think that's a tremendous insight. And I think that um, we can all take a note from that, because I think people who have grown up being creative and playing in the band at
Mhm.
school, or wanting to hang out with their friends and play music or whatever, they're sort of, there has been stereotypes, just kind of like, oh, they're just a musician.
Mhm.
And I think, except if you're in the classical business. So I think that's a very very wise statement. So if I were to rephrase that for our audience, because what we teach people is that they are a brand and a business. And so,
Mhm.
along with that, as a business, you are well equipped to understand your finances because you play music.
Exactly. I just came across a quote from Einstein, and he said that creativity is intelligence having a good time. And I think that that is something really for any creative to hang their hat on, because there really are no people more creative and more intelligent than, in my book, musicians. And it does translate to understanding math and therefore understanding money. It's just the stereotype and the inherent anxiety that the unknown brings.
So, okay, I'm Joe Creative, or Josie Creative.
Mm-hmm.
Where I'm coming to you, and I really don't know top from bottom or east from west. Where do I start? What is the absolute first thing that everybody needs to pay attention to and keep track of?
Well, first and foremost, everybody has to understand they need to keep their money separate. They have to have their personal accounts and their business accounts. Never the two shall meet. That's very important because that not only makes it easiest to track, it also makes it easiest for it to be a justifiable transaction as a business. It can't be something where if somebody comes in from the outside and says, "Oh, you bought this ticket to this show through your personal account, you can't have it as a business account. You can't have it as a business expense, excuse me." When we know that as music professionals, whether you're a musician or somebody in the industry like ourselves, if you're going to a show, that's your business. That's deductible. frankly, if you're doing anything related to popular culture, that's your business. That's a business expense. You know, you can
So
look at,
if
go ahead.
I'm a new person, is it necessary to have a separate checking and savings account if that's the way I'm used to doing things? Obviously, most transactions are done online now. Um,
You
but is
definitely
it
need to have,
absolutely necessary for someone,
yes.
even if you're just a singer, songwriter, performer at the local coffee
Yeah,
shop?
exactly. Because even as a simple singer songwriter going up and doing small gigs, taking tips, even if you're out busking, okay, and just taking change off of people and dollar bills and whatever, you need to have a separate checking account, at least checking. You don't necessarily need to worry about savings until it gets due, where you need to stash something away. But so long as you can manage that one checking account, then you have everything right there in front of you, because your bank statements will translate to your income statements, your financial statements. That's what's going to be the foundation of your income statement and your balance sheet, which then translate to your tax return.
And isn't there a thing I know in our business called piercing the veil? That if you don't want to mix your stuff because it can disqualify certain if you commingle funds of or
Mhm.
they're not in the right place, you can get in trouble. Is basically what I'm trying to say.
Well, I don't like to use the word in trouble. There are certainly plenty of celebrities who have gotten in trouble because of how they've handled their finances. But I heard somebody say at some point, I think on Clubhouse, that if you get audited, which is what everybody's afraid of, except for me, I'm like,
I've been
but
audited, so I'm not afraid of it anymore. It's
yeah,
just
exactly.
people doing their jobs, and
Right.
it's a ridiculous protocol. You just have to be able to prove that you're right and that everything is okay.
Exactly. If you have a way to substantiate it, even if it's just a line item on your bank statement that proves that a third party did this transaction and it just didn't go into the ether or come in from the ether. What somebody told me on Clubhouse was that an audit is really just an open book test.
Oh, that's
So that
interesting.
that way, yeah, because they'll just go through your annual transactions for whatever year they're auditing, and they'll be like, you have here for your phone expenses a payment to whatever provider for this amount of money. Can I see the invoice for that? And you just go, here, there you go. Or,
So back to your bookkeeping and checking account, would you
mhm,
recommend to everybody? I mean, I know this sounds very simplistic, but um, going back to the stereotypes once again, should you
mhm.
have a place, one place that you put everything so that you can get at it if it's not a digital piece of paper or a receipt or something like that, so that you don't have to go hunting for it. I mean, these are simple concepts, but it makes it a lot easier when it comes time to fill out your balance sheet or
Right, right. What I recommend everybody does is this is basically the steps. Get a separate checking account, get what's referred to as an accordion file, where you have many different pockets and it's got a nice little closure on it so that you can put whatever physical receipts or statements that you have. You can put them in there every month, including your bank statements. And what I really recommend everybody does is once a week, translate your bank activity onto ideally a spreadsheet or just simply a book that you can list out what is income and what is a type of expense. So you would have everything broken out into categories, whether it's networking, whether it's media, whether it's your website expenses, whether it's your revenue from streaming, whether it's your gig fees or equipment expenses. And then you also have things that you have to detail out, which you have equipment expense. You also might have assets that are your equipment. And that's a whole new kettle of fish where you decide based on how much the item cost versus how much you're going to use it or for how long it's going to have a life for you to use it with, whether or not it becomes an expense or you keep it on your books as an asset.
Do you
And you,
have a recommendation for that, or, I mean, a rule of
well,
thumb to kind of go by? Because what if I've had this Strat for 10 years and I haven't used it, and now I really like this, decided I like the sound, so I'm going to start using it. Do you take the value of when you purchased it, or, um, you
well,
know,
yeah, what you do is you do take the value of when you purchased it. Things like guitars and instruments that you're always playing, I always recommend people take into account a few things. One is whether or not you're doing this just simply under your own social security number, which would qualify you as a self employed sole proprietor. If you decide to incorporate or put together an LLC, which is really not as dramatic or detail oriented as it sounds sometimes, if you do that and you decide to put that instrument on the books of your quote unquote company, then it is no longer yours. It is owned by your company. If anything
and
goes
that's when you can
sideways,
write it off.
either way you can write it off, but it's whether or not it's protected.
Ah,
So if you have an instrument that you were given and you never want to part with, that it's, intrinsically yours, you find a great deal of identity in it. Let's just say you decide to go with an LLC just to protect yourself. Because if you own a house, I highly recommend doing an LLC or anything like that for anything that you own that you don't want to risk in your business. Because let's just say some tragic incident happens, like the fire, I think, in Rhode Island during the White Lion White Lion concert.
oh yeah, that tragic. Oh,
Yeah, where they loaded up the pyros way too much and it set the entire place on fire. And the band ended up being sued because people lost their lives. People were traumatized, the whole gamut. And it's an extreme example. I understand that, but it's an extreme example for a reason. Anything that was on the books of their quote unquote corporation would, when found against them in law, would be liquidated. So if their instruments are on those books, those instruments get liquidated. So they'll never see them again unless they find a way to pay for them themselves. And
so,
those are the kind of things that you have to decide upon, whether or
so
not you want to
JudeAnne,
keep.
if you aren't, which, if I hear you correctly, if you are a performing songwriter, or you are pursuing a music career,
Mhm.
that you are recommending that you protect your assets by putting them under the protection of an LLC or some kind of an officially recognized designation. And each state is
Yes,
different, but
right.
so even
Each
if
state
you
is
have a
different.
gig working in a corporation and you're only doing the weekends, you should still do that, right?
I think that you definitely have to look at it. And I'm sorry to go into such a deep dive, but it's really a fairly important idea to consider. If if
That's
you
why you're
are
here. And I'm not the one talking.
I know. If your career or your life has gotten to a point where you have basically people that you're responsible for, if you have an asset like a house, or you have children that you're saving for college for, then yes, I say you need to do an LLC and have all of your music business activities go through that, so that that way it's the LLC that is at risk and not your house and not your children's future. Okay. So if anything unforeseen, catastrophic, whatever happens, you at least have that barrier between your business and your life. And that's what's important. And then you get to the point where you say, okay, I have this instrument that I love. as much as my children. So it's not going to go on my
Loose
books. I'm
meal.
certainly, yeah. So I'm certainly going to keep it and play it, but it's not going to be an asset on my books. It's not going to be an asset in my company, even though I'm going to use it as through my business. It doesn't mean that you can't play it when you're performing, but it's just whether or not you want to throw it into the mix as if something happens, I can live without this item. So back to the basic question as to how you determine between an expense and an asset. Basically, anything that doesn't have a shelf life beyond the year, like guitar strings, twing, they go, that's an expense. Drumsticks, expense. Cables, expense. You decide yourself what the dollar value is and what the life is for those kind of items. And if they don't have a year-long life, then you just write them off. If they do
It's a
have,
good barometer.
yeah, if they have more than a year's life to them, like an amplifier where you know you're going to be using it for 3 to 5 years, then it's an asset. And what your accountant will do for you then is say, okay, is it 3 to 5 years that you're going to be using it? We'll take 5 years for an example. So we'll divide the amount of money that you spent on it by five, and that's the amount we expense off each year until it's through its quote unquote useful life.
I have a question. I hope it's not a curveball. What if I'm a songwriter and I have a piece of software like Master Writer, or and that's a program that is fairly costly?
Mm-hmm.
How do I set that up? That's
Same
obviously
way.
same thing.
Mm-hmm. If it's costly and it's something that you're going to use for a long time, where you might have add ons to it or whatever, then yeah, you want to have that as an asset. Because one of the things everybody needs to understand is that musicians, particularly, are kind of subjected to the IRS's quote unquote definition of a business. Because if it's not a company that is generating revenue after 3 years of losses reported, the IRS could come back and say, dude, this is really a hobby. This is not a business. You can't take these deductions. Okay. So if you have a big piece of equipment that you're investing in, particularly right out of the gate, and that makes the difference between you showing a profit or a loss because you made this huge investment, you're better off having it on your books as an asset and only taking a part of the expense, so that that way you can at least reflect that you had a profit, even if it's just $50 as a profit. It doesn't matter. They just say profit. It doesn't say profit of such and such amount. You say, I made a profit. This is a business.
So do you think you're making some really exceptional points here? Going back to your STEM analogy, would you also say that for songwriters and musicians, they need to adjust their thinking in terms of their income, their outgo, their expenses, all of this, so that, going back to the Billy Joel analogy, kind of like, well, he lost all this money because he wasn't paying attention to what was happening with it. So, but if you're making weekend income as a performer in some way, whether it's a performing songwriter, busking, or a band that's playing party gigs or whatever, then you need to be thinking of yourself as a business, even if it's not 40 hours a week, correct?
Yes. And any kind of activity where you're making money and you're putting out money, that's a business. It really is. It doesn't matter if you make $500 for the year and you have expenses of $300 for the year. You still made $200. So you want to have that history documented. And there's multiple reasons for it. First and foremost is that kind of rule of thumb that the IRS uses, that if you don't make a profit early on in your career for like the first 3 years, then they'll come off and say, hey, dude, can't do it. You're just bumming around. It's a hobby for you. you're not doing enough to make it serious, blah blah blah. And of course, their suits, what do they know? We know the difference. Then you also have the idea of what is going to be rather controversial that I'm going to say right now. Self-employment taxes. I know that it's kind of bringing up the hairs on the neck of everybody right now, but self-employment taxes are fairly important, particularly for musicians, because if you go watch that documentary that I mentioned, The Hired Guns on Amazon Prime, sorry to keep pushing that, but it was really good. They show you exactly how that life is, and particularly how it comes and it goes sporadically and without notice, which means you're not going to have necessarily a 401k that you can turn to when you get older. Now, while you're building your career, even if you're just making 500 bucks, paying self-employment tax, which is really just Social Security and Medicare, that will add on to whatever you get as part of your retirement. And you may shrug that off, but when you're looking down the end of the road, it's going to be something where you go, oh, I should.
I know people that can't qualify for Social Security or certain things because they never did that.
Right, exactly. Because it's only for the people who work or were supported by someone who worked, like traditional housewives who never worked. Basically my grandmother and even my mother. But that's something that
I'm glad you brought that up because it's really important. And
right,
if you have an LLC in the state of Tennessee, where our company is headquartered, we have to file quarterly, tax statements. And even if it's, it doesn't matter what the bottom line or your revenue is, but you have to be accountable if you are an incorporated business under an LLC structure in our state, that you have to, and they're not going to come and remind you of it either. It's something.
No, and what you're talking about, Beth, is estimated payments for your income tax for your company. And that is very important. The estimated taxes, both for federal and all states, is based on your performance from the year before.
Right.
So in the very simple example of making 500, having 300 of expenses and 200 as quote unquote income, which was left over in that, you would be taxed on that $200 by whatever percentage. And since you're the company, you don't have somebody giving you a check and saying, hey, I paid the rest to the government for you for your taxes. It's incumbent on you to do that. So that's where you would look at your tax responsibility for the year based on the prior year's income, saying, okay, so we need to take that amount, basically divide it by 4, and make regular payments every quarter on that, so that way the government has their money as the year goes on, and you don't get hit with anything that's referred to as a payment penalty where you didn't pay enough.
And they will tax you, the penalties in the state of Tennessee are usually higher than what the amount would be. I don't know if that's true in the other states, but I just think for most people, especially as things have been changing during the pandemic, it's absolutely critical that people know what they're doing with their money. And
right, because things like penalties really kind of get to people where that's a disciplinary term. I'm going to be in trouble.
Well, it comes from penance, the Latin term for penance.
Right, and nobody wants to do penance, and I understand that. But the thing is that if you're keeping track of your finances as time goes on, then you know exactly what you're doing throughout the year. And you'll know exactly where you are as far as your income goes. Because remember, your estimated payments are completely voluntary. Okay? So you can literally look at how you're doing throughout the year. We're already into the fourth quarter of the year. So, using you as an example, Beth, not to bring out any numbers or tell tales out of school, but if you're looking at what you've done and compare it to 2020,
Mm-hmm.
then you look at what the bottom line is and you can project out, you know what's happening for you for the rest of the year. You can project out what your bottom line is going to approximately be based on averaging out the year that's been so far. So you can say last year we ended up with this income and paying this tax. This year we have this income, which may or be this way, or it may be that way, or it may be the same. So, depending on how that is, you can say, hmm, we might have done better, so we might have to pay more. We might have done not as well, so maybe we can get away with paying less. So it's all a balance that you have to do, and please do it in consultation with your tax professionals.
Now,
Disclaimer
speaking of
out there.
which, before we get to that point, because you were referencing different categories, what are the absolute basic categories that every creator needs to be thinking about when they're putting together their spreadsheet? You have income, which can be how detailed within income, like all your revenue streams or just the big ones, or
Well, you have to account for all of your revenue. That's plain and simple. Whether or not you just simply have one column that says income, that's up to you. You can have a couple of columns, one that says gigs, one that says session playing, one that says
streaming minus
streaming,
34.
one that says uh, sync placements. Whatever the revenue streams that you have coming in,
Or
you can
merch.
detail them out or you can lump them all together. It's up to you and how you want to handle it. I recommend detail. Do what you feel comfortable with. But you want to make sure that you're accounting for all of your expenses and categorizing them properly. Now, everybody's expenses are going to vary because not everybody has the same things that they're doing. If you're not paying out live, you don't need to worry about your mileage on your car as you're driving from gig to gig. Okay. If you are gigging, keep track of your mileage because that's going to be a deduction. Okay. If everybody's going to be buying equipment, so you're going to have that expense. If you have insurance, that would
Somebody
be an
asked a
expense.
question, asked in the chat if you would recommend insurance for your company to protect you.
Yes, it depends on what level you're at and how much liability you have. But yeah, basic liability and even a policy called error and omissions might be applicable to you depending on how often you're playing out, what you're taking responsibility for, etc. It just depends on whether you feel that that's going to cover you for your activities.
Okay, so we have our all our different income categories. Do you have what do you put in your losses category?
Well, your expenses, because you don't know if you're going to come up with a loss or an income, but you're going to have basic things. Like I said, transportation, auto expenses, and this is for going back and forth for whatever is business oriented.
Do you pay
So,
yourself a per diem if you're out doing a little tour or a house concert tour?
well, here's the thing. Um, per diems are much like travel and entertainment expenses. And the IRS kind of got wise to meals and entertainment expenses way back in probably the early 90s, where only half of your meals and entertainment is actually deductible because they finally figured out, hey, they got to eat anyway. So if if you're out buying somebody lunch or buying somebody a drink at your gig, the drink that you buy for somebody else is deductible. The drink you buy for yourself is not. Now, that's not to say that if you only buy somebody a drink and you don't drink yourself, that that's fully deductible, because it's all going to be totaled up with all your other meals and entertainment,
Mhm.
and it's still going to be cut in half. So I guess I'm saying get yourself a beverage anyway.
Um, so going to, I know seems fairly obvious, but based on the complexity of what your financial picture looks like, um, when do you decide that a bookkeeper's okay, or you really need an accountant? Because I think that's a question a lot of people are uncertain about.
Well, let's just put it this way: you need to understand what you need for the job at hand. And that means that there are different professionals for different tasks. Your day in and day out transactions, keeping track of that, I highly recommend that if you are strong, viable, ready to take on the challenge, you do it yourself. In this business, you learn so much by doing it yourself. There's nothing like accomplishing a new task. And I'm telling you all right now, you have it in you to tackle these tasks. Because frankly, if I can do it, you can do
That's wonderful. No, it's all about self-empowerment, and that's another thing that Music Row 411 is absolutely fierce about,
it. Right.
because you have to be your own champion. You're the business, so you have to know
Mm-hmm.
what you're supposed to do, because by the time you get to a point where you have somebody else, you have to be able to understand what they're telling you and look for
Exactly.
irregularities or red
Mm-hmm.
flags. And
Right.
so,
Right.
speaking of which, since I'm going a little out of order, but what are some red flags if you do decide that it's, you know, I just don't have time to tackle this right now. My bandwidth in my brain is still suffering from COVID, and I have this other part-time job, so I don't really know. So I think I'm going to get somebody. What are some red flags to be aware of? Because back to your original stereotype, there are predators, and people go, oh, these people are too stupid. They're never going to pick up on this, or they're not going to catch this, and they don't know what the average is, or
Right. Right. Well, there's so much to this answer because there are so many ways that I have seen these really outrageous things go down. Um, but I'm going to urge everybody, if you're not going to do it yourself, know how it's done, know how it's done well, and know how it's done in your best interest. Most importantly, though, is for you, you have to know what is referred to as your nut. In the live industry, we refer to it as the house nut. Any club, any arena, all of them know to throw the door. Yay, we're back. Are we good, Beth?
no, I'm here.
Okay.
You're freezing
So
up a little
everybody
bit.
needs, yeah, I saw it freeze up. So everybody needs to know their house nut. It's what every venue knows when they're booking a gig, exactly how much money they need to make at the door in order to cover their basic expenses to open the door and turn on the lights. Everybody know that, both on a personal basis and on a business basis, because your business is to take care of your personal stuff anyway. So know those both so that that way you know when something's coming in, how much needs to go out. And if somebody keeps coming back to you and saying This isn't there. This isn't there. This isn't there. And you can calculate in your head, well, we did this, we did that, we did this. Generally, that'll bring us this from past experience. And we paid out that. So there should be this. Why isn't it there? It's
So if
not unlike
they're
the
saying to
experience
you
of
that
when we give our children money.
you know that there
Mhm.
is income, and they're telling you that there is not.
Right.
Is that
Well, let's just take the tried and true example. Okay, we all know that when we were kids, and everybody who has kids has gone, here's $5, sweetheart. Go into the store, grab some milk, and come back out to me. Just to give the kids some experience with doing some transactions like that. And you're going to have kids that come out going, here's the milk, here's your change, here's your milk. Change? I don't, there was no change. Like, yeah, I gave you $5 for $1.55. Come on. It's really not much different. And those are the kind of things you have to look out for.
But I mean,
So,
even when you call them, are there questions that are or red flag alerts, like if they're asking you certain things?
well, I would look for time delays. I would like if somebody's just doing a bank reconciliation for you on a monthly basis, if it's dragging out for like 2 or 3 months and you're behind, yeah, it happens. I mean, sometimes people are just busy and they have to prioritize different tasks that they're doing. That could be it. Or it could be that they just don't want to tell you something. So it's figuring out the difference between just being busy and being too busy to discuss something that might be off, because mistakes can happen. They just purely can happen. I know that because I'm dyslexic, and there are times when I've turned numbers around and it looked really good, and but it wasn't good. It wasn't good. So, but basically, anybody can go by their instinct on when they know something is right and when something is wrong. And let's just get back to the Billy Joel thing, because I think that that's actually a really important thing to readdress right now. We mentioned Billy Joel losing millions, millions to basically a family member, a brother in law. He was also the godfather to his daughter, somebody who was substantial in his life. Was it because Billy didn't care about the business side of it? Was it because Billy didn't know about the business side of it? Or was it because he trusted his family member? Was it all three? We'll never know. It's not really our business, but it's our business to know that those are pitfalls. So I can tell you stories about Adam Clayton from U2. He lost hundreds of thousands of dollars to somebody who embezzled upon him, who he knew for more than a decade. You know, that's all fine and dandy. But the thing is when I read that story, I read down to the real facts. He had originally hired that person as a house cleaner. And somehow they rolled up to being his personal business manager.
That's
So it's like,
stupidity.
don't say that about Adam. It was a bad choice out of a good heart.
Well, I
You can
think
do
what
this.
you're saying is you need to vet people. You need to check references. You need to
Right.
make sure that they have the qualifications to do something. You wouldn't go to a quack doctor knowing that the doctor didn't have the information and the education to treat you for what you're going to see him for,
Right.
right?
As much as we want to help the people that are around us, and we want to trust the people that are around us and give people around us, their shot or the chance to have experience like this, it's still something where you have to consider your best interest. You don't necessarily want to be the guinea pig for your housekeeper who wants to be a bookkeeper. I
So
just
I
don't
have a
necessarily recommend it.
question to assessing all of this. Do you have a resource, or is there a book that you recommend, or a website that you recommend to people to sort of get up to speed on some of these things so that they can learn themselves? I mean, you still have to be able to converse with whoever you hire,
Right.
but like you said, you can do it and you can get good at it. So where should they go to learn for themselves?
Well, um, frankly, those are part of the services I offer through JA Creatives Consulting. But if you want to just get a crash course on it, when you open your checking account, why not talk to your banker about it?
Oh, that's a great idea. That's a great idea.
Ask,
Or they could come to someone like yourself
right.
and take a course or a mini, sort of take some lessons about that, which would save them time and I don't want to say shortcuts because there are not shortcuts to money management.
No, there's always more to learn and more to understand. It all depends on what kind of knowledge you're already bringing to the table. There are some people where I have to explain the difference between a debit and a credit. And believe me, it's simpler than you think, but not as easy as you want it to be. So it's
I
one of
like that.
those things.
I'm gonna quote that. I think we'll put that in a soundbite.
There you go. So there are those kind of fundamentals, and then there's also the idea of money is much like life. It doesn't always stay the same, and it sometimes changes form, but you always are accounting for it in some way or another. You know, so you just have to understand and embrace a more philosophical way of looking at your money that isn't going to stress you out, because it really is simple addition, subtraction. And then looking at the money that you're putting out and saying, did I get my money's worth from that transaction?
So, speaking of transactions, what can people expect? What is the cost differential between hiring an accountant or an accounting firm and hiring a bookkeeper?
Well,
Because
you
they're
actually
different
can hire,
skill sets.
they are different skill sets, and you need them for different reasons. You can certainly go to an accounting firm and hire a bookkeeping service through them. Most of them offer that, but you're going to pay woohoo prices for that. I think I saw last that those prices are generally 50 to 75 an hour for bookkeeping services. An accountant,
Sounds about
depending on
right.
what, yeah, an accountant for what you're looking for would probably be somebody that you want to be able to interpret your financial statements, meaning they take the bookkeeper's work, create it into these two statements, the income statement and the balance sheet, and they basically explain to you what those things say. Although all of you can figure that out. You made this much, you spent this much, this is the end result. You own this much, you owe this much, and therefore you have this much. And that's really all those two statements tell you. But then you need the accountant to take those two statements into your tax return. And that's where you get into the hunky dory stuff of the meals and entertainment only being at half. If you're, let's just say, we're using Billy Joel still as an example. Let's just ride him for the entire time. Why not? As Billy Joel,
Drinking in Long Island. So.
right. So, as Billy Joel, there is, I guarantee you, multiple life insurance policies on Billy Joel through his record company, possibly through his management company, through his own company. And the policy for his own company, where he's considered an essential part of the business, he's insured because when he goes, the business goes
Right.
somewhat. Um, but that money paid out to that particular insurance policy is not deductible. You take it out of you put it into your expenses so that you see what you've actually made for the year. But when your taxes are done, that money's added back because they're like, yeah, but that's not our problem. You're here now, so this is what you actually made. And those are the kind of things that accountants know the difference of. And
Right.
then,
And they have a certification um,
right,
that they have to be accountable to their professional degree by,
yeah, right.
you
And they
know,
have to uphold their ethics and etc. for that. So, but the thing
I
is,
mean,
particularly,
they're all honest, but there is a mechanism that is
yeah,
supposed
there's
to
recourse.
govern them.
Right, there's recourse. But this is where I also emphasize that you're best off finding somebody who is experienced in the creative arts and particularly in the music business. Because, like I said, we can buy a ticket to a show and we consider that networking, we consider that research, we consider that whatever it is, but it's a business expense. I personally, I'll go out on a limb and say this personally, I deduct my cable expenses. If I have my Netflix, it's written off through my business because I need to understand what's going on in popular culture. And
Absolutely.
right. So those are the kind of things that, anybody through one of these dial up internet
Acme
kind of,
accounting.
yeah, Acme accounting that you find with the green banner and the H and that other acronym on there, they're not going to know that and they're going to argue with you about it. Whereas this is a case where you know better than the accountant and they're not going to be able to look at your best interest because they don't understand your industry.
Right. Well, I think if you were a restaurant, you would prefer, especially a viable restaurant, you would prefer to deal with someone that understood the inner workings of your business because it's very different than a trucking company, for example.
You'd be surprised how much they're alike. You really would. Because when I was doing public accounting, most of my clients were actually broker dealers on the stock exchange. And these were the guys that were down there throwing paper all around, yelling at each other, throwing up these symbols saying, buy this, sell that, buy this, sell that. And, this was the 80s. So they were making money hand over fist. And then I also had clients that were landscapers. And the process was still the same. We didn't need to understand that this is intrinsic to this business or this is intrinsic to this business because it wasn't as specialized as you think. Whereas music and creativity, those are different animals from regular business. And that's why you need to have somebody who really understands it or at least is able to respect it as a business.
So, getting yourself ready, as you mentioned, we're in Q4.
Mm-hmm.
How much time would you recommend? Somebody that has, I'm not talking about someone who went out and played one song, but someone who has been creating throughout the year. They've done demos, they have a chunk of a career, if not a full-fledged career. When do you recommend, because everybody's like, oh, I can get an extension. When do you recommend people start getting their act together in terms of aggregating the information and sorting it out and getting it in, some semblance of, I don't know, a report that they can then transfer to, a tax return if they're doing it themselves, and pursuant to that, do you recommend something if somebody is not in a position to hire a JudeAnne Armenti, who's fabulous? Should they get QuickBooks for small business or one of those, sort of baby accounting things that they can, a ledger system they can keep up with in a spreadsheet in their computer?
Well, I'm going to tell you this right now. Right now is when you start preparing all your stuff for the end of the year, for during your taxes. Because I encourage everybody to keep up with it all year long. And just like we were talking about before with your estimated payments all year long, right now you can look and see approximately what you still owe toward your taxes. And you would know whether or not you need to up them or whether or not you can start to dial them back because they're not going to know until you file your final tax return. You get to be the arbiter and the judge of to how much you need to pay to keep from having any untoward things come back at you as a business person. But more importantly than that is I highly recommend that you get your stuff to an accountant immediately. All forms have to be to corporations and individuals by the end of January for W 2s, and I think it's the end of or the middle of February for 1099s, which are what are given to self employed people and businesses. Um, so, but a business tax return is generally due March 15th with the IRS. And there are tax returns for various businesses that do what's called flowing through to the personal tax return. But I still recommend that you have the business one done in time for the March 15 deadline so that that way you can actually file early for your personal one.
Well,
because I have this one particular mindset that not everybody agrees with, but you should. I have many people that I've done the tax returns for, and this one particular family, their sons had this competition on who I could, quote unquote, get the best tax return for. And they would compete every year amongst themselves. And I just sat there rolling my eyes because getting a big tax refund is ripping yourself off all year long. You are volunteering to give the government your money that they are going to earn interest on and they are going to grow while you don't have that money to cover your bills or to increase your savings or to start investing on or to put towards your future. And everybody needs to get around to the idea that in order for us to sustain ourselves, we have to kind of start adopting the mentality of the 1%, where they have their money working for them. They have their money generating money. We might not get up to their level, but we can have enough coming in to say, wow, that's a little cushion. I like seeing that. And then that cushion gets a little bit bigger. And that way, to me, that's the best form of personal self-care is taking care of your money because all your stress, all your worries come back to what you can or cannot afford.
that's so awesome, JudeAnne. Obviously, we're coming up on the hour, and we could be here for days.
You know I can talk, Beth.
Benefiting from your immense wisdom. And so I ask you now, there's obviously much more to unpack. Would you be willing to come back for part 2 and or part 3 for our audience? Because I know you have given us so many golden nuggets tonight, and they're going to have to watch the replay several times to get it all down. And there are people in the chat saying, "Oh my God, I need to, I need to be taking notes, but this is so good. I don't want to stop, listening to write things down." So will you come back to Live from MR 411 for part 2?
I'd love to. This is great.
Yeah, because you know what, you and all of you out there know that she has just scratched the surface, but JudeAnne has truly given you some really major points to take under your advisement right now, because it is October 21st, 2021. How do you like that? 10/21/2021. And the time is ticking. And the other thing that JudeAnne didn't say, but the other thing to know is that professionals who are involved in keeping track of money, whether they're bookkeepers or accountants, you're not their only client. They got other people they got to take care of too. So It's sort of, if you're the last one in the door, you're probably going to be the last one helped. And you need to be proactive, is what I've heard JudeAnne say over and over again tonight. JudeAnne, do you have any last jewel or piece of advice to give our creator community about how to take care of their money? You should check out jacreativeconsulting.com for JudeAnne's services. And before we go, don't miss the chance to find out more about our experts coming up and other things about Music Row 411. You can go to www.musicrow411.com. We've got some very exciting things that are coming down the pike, and we'd love to have you as part of our community. So be sure and check us out. You can find us on the socials too, because we bring you people like JudeAnne, and you can't just find her anywhere. She's worked with Aerosmith and the touring companies for Bon Jovi and the Biebs, so don't miss out on an opportunity to go to her website, find her. She's very active on Clubhouse. She's always dropping incredible wisdom there. And she and I are going to host a room coming down the pike on Clubhouse, and we'll let you know when that's going to happen. But one last comment from JudeAnne for the MR411 community.
Don't be intimidated by the basic principles of bookkeeping. Make sure you keep it simple for yourself, and don't be afraid to ask for help. Just be very intuitive about who you ask for help.
That's so great. Well, thank you, JudeAnne. You have been such a wonderful speaker this evening, and I know that our community and everybody that's been with us tonight and will be watching on the replay will be so happy to have heard you, and will start putting your wisdom to use right away. So signing off from Music Row 411, we hope you all have a great rest of your evening, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks so much, Beth.